The letter wasn't meant to be found. Tucked between pages of a forgotten book, one Claire had priced at 50 cents but never really wanted to sell, it slid onto the floor with the sound of something breaking quietly. She stared at the envelope, fingers hesitating, breath caught halfway between fear and a strange, aching familiarity. No name, just the way the ink bled slightly where his pen had pressed too hard. She had memorized that pressure once. As she opened it, the words blinked back at her like ghosts. You always made things more complicated than they had to be. A laugh, bitter and quiet, escaped her lips. Was it too complicated to want to be seen? To cry and not be asked to apologize for it? She whispered into the silence, not expecting an answer. Maybe I wasn't too much. Maybe you were just too little. Have you ever been called too much just because you felt too deeply? If you have, this story might feel like yours. Claire. Morrison lived in a coastal town that tourists forgot, but the sea remembered. The kind of place where the wind carried old secrets and the seagulls circled above the same crooked bench each morning. Her house stood at the corner of Maple and Grace, a 2-story weathered thing with peeling shutters and a front porch too big for one person. But that was how she liked it. She ran a used bookstore 3 blocks from home, the kind filled with titles no one asked for and margins filled with strangers' regrets. On good days, the bell over the door rang twice. On quiet ones, she read old love letters tucked inside donated paperbacks, pretending they were written for her. To most, Claire seemed content. Mid-40s, warm in her silences, the kind of woman who brewed tea with intention and always had soft music playing in the background. But there were things they didn't see. The way she touched the spine of a particular poetry book but never took it home. Or how she avoided the cafe across from the florist because that was where he used to wait. She had once loved deeply, so deeply it made her question if she was asking too much or if he was simply offering too little. He had called her difficult when she cried at music, when she needed time, when she asked for words he didn't have the language for. And she had believed him, for a long time. So she learned to shrink, to edit herself, to make love easier to digest. Until one morning, she simply stopped. Not loudly, not dramatically. She just didn't apologize anymore. Now, in this sleepy town. Claire moved through her days like she had made peace with being invisible. But in truth, she was waiting. Not for him, not even for closure. Just for a moment, however small, where she could say aloud what she'd never been allowed to feel. It began with the smallest sound, barely a whisper, the soft slide of paper across old tile. Claire almost missed it, busy restacking a pile of unsold books, her thoughts drifting elsewhere, likely to the weather or what to make for dinner that night. But then she heard it again, subtle and distinct, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a room long accustomed to silence. She turned slowly, expecting perhaps a flyer or catalog, something from the postman she rarely saw anymore. Instead, she found an envelope on the floor by the door, cream-colored, thick, its edges curled as if it had waited too long to arrive. It wasn't postmarked, and there was no name on the return line, just her first name, Claire, written in that old-fashioned, slanted script she had trained herself to forget. Her breath caught, not in a dramatic way, but like a muscle tightening from memory. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and stared at the handwriting. She didn't need a signature. That precise curl in the R, the extra loop at the end of the E. Evan. It had been 13 years. 13 years since he left. 13 years since she'd packed away every photograph, every shared playlist, every reminder of who she'd been when she loved him. She hadn't heard a word since. Not a call, not an apology, not even an accidental email. Nothing. And yet here, on a rainy Thursday morning, in a bookshop that smelled of dust and lavender polish, his name had returned. She didn't open it. Not at first. Instead, she turned the kettle on, more for routine than desire, and watched the steam rise in slow spirals. The envelope stayed on the counter, daring her to break whatever fragile piece she'd managed to build. She reached for her mug, white ceramic, chipped at the handle, and held it like an anchor. The room felt colder than before, though the rain outside remained soft and almost romantic, like a film score gently rising beneath her thoughts. When she finally unfolded the envelope, it was slower than she expected, as if each crease held weight, and every breath she took threatened to blur the ink. Inside wasn't a letter, not a confession, not a regret. It was a printed invitation. Their university's 25-year reunion, held next month in a hall. She could still remember green velvet chairs, weak coffee, and the smell of old polish on the wooden floors. The formal print alone might not have stirred her, but there, at the bottom, just beneath the RSVP line, was a handwritten postscript. 5 words. Didn't know if you'd come. E. She reread it 3 times, the pen stroke of the dash before, his initial like a pause that once held breath, hesitation, or something unsaid. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a question. But somehow, it shook her more than if it had been pages long. Claire set the card down beside her tea, now cold. The rain outside had grown heavier, beating rhythmically against the windows, like the sound of all the things they never said. She hadn't thought of Evan in months, at least not consciously. And yet here she was, hand trembling, breath shallow, as if the years hadn't passed at all. As if she were 28 again, still asking for something simple, to be seen, to be held without shrinking, to be called enough without having to earn it. Later that evening, long after she'd closed the shop and left the lights dimmed in the window, Claire sat on her porch in the soft dusk. The envelope rested in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the horizon where sea met sky in blurred edges. She didn't know if she would go to the reunion, but she knew something had shifted. Something old had woken up, not love, not anger, something quieter, the urge to write, not to him, but for herself, for the version of Claire who had once asked for less because she thought that made her easier to love. Maybe this time she would write the things she never dared, say out loud, not to be heard, but simply to be whole again. Claire had always believed in the quiet power of objects, how something as simple as a pressed flower in a book could hold the shape of a summer, or how an old receipt could return a person to the exact moment they decided to stay too long. That morning, she woke early with the strange sensation that something inside her had shifted, like furniture being moved in the dark. She dressed slowly, choosing a blue cardigan with a loose thread she never pulled, then made her way down to the bookstore. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like wet pavement and salt. She unlocked the front door, fed Leonard the cat who now considered the shop his kingdom, and flicked on the lights, letting the familiar yellow glow settle into the corners of the room. For a while, she just sat, watching dust move in shafts of light, listening to the soft crackle of an old record spinning something wordless in the background. Her fingers brushed over the invitation again, now resting on the counter. It felt absurd how something so small could stir so much. She hadn't planned on reopening that drawer, the one beneath the register, left untouched for years. But her hand moved toward it almost instinctively. Inside was the journal. Not a daily record, but a collection of pages she only turned to when words refused to stay quiet inside her. She hadn't opened it since Evan left. The cover was soft, with wear, navy blue and edged with gold. When she opened it, the scent of lavender and thyme greeted her. And there it was, the entry that made her throat tighten like a string pulled too tight. I cried today. I don't even know why. The coffee tasted too bitter, or the sky was too gray, or maybe I just missed who I used to be before trying so hard to be less. He looked at me like I was making things up, said I read too much into everything, that I should relax more, that I was exhausting. Claire blinked. The tears didn't come. Not this time. She turned the page. I told him I needed softness. I needed quiet reassurances. I needed to feel like I could fall apart without it being a burden. He didn't say anything, just got up and left the room. She closed the journal. Her fingers pressed against the cover for a long while, as though trying to absorb some forgotten version of herself trapped between the pages. Then, in a voice, no louder than the tick of the wall clock, she said it. You called me sensitive, but you never once asked why I was crying. The journal stayed on the counter all day, unopened but not ignored, as if its very presence altered the air inside the shop. Claire didn't need to read more. She already knew what those pages held. Unspoken pleadings, small humiliations, half-shed, truths that had once felt too messy to be named aloud. But now, with years between then and now, she saw them not as signs of weakness, but of clarity unrecognized. Around mid-afternoon, she closed early, locking the bookstore and heading home through streets that shimmered with drying rain. The sky had cleared slightly, and golden light spilled over the cobblestones like an afterthought. There was something strange in her chest. Not quite sadness, not quite peace. A kind of ache that came with looking back too long. Once home, she made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink and sat at the small desk by her bedroom window. She opened her laptop, not to work, but to type Evan's name. Not because she wanted to reconnect, but because curiosity, long held at bay, had finally ripened into something undeniable. It didn't take long. A local article appeared first, a feature from 2 years ago, a light lifestyle piece about reinventing oneself after divorce. His picture startled her, not for how he looked, but for how familiar it still felt. He hadn't changed much, a few more lines near the eyes perhaps, but the expression, reserved, measured, just shy of warm, was exactly as she remembered. She read the article slowly, unsure of what she was hoping to find. It was bland, mostly. How he took up sailing, learned to cook, saw a therapist for the first time. But one paragraph caught her breath mid-inhale. I think men my age were taught to fear intensity. We called it drama or too much emotion. But really, it was just women asking to be heard. I failed at that, more than once. I wish I'd known how to stay in the room, to ask the questions that mattered. Claire's eyes stung. Not from grief, but from the strange, complex tangle of being seen too late. She closed the laptop without finishing the article. It didn't matter. Anymore, growth that arrives after someone leaves doesn't change what you endured when they stayed. That evening, she placed the journal on a shelf behind the register, visible but unlabeled, between a volume of Adrienne Rich poems and a memoir by a woman who also once made herself smaller for love, not as a keepsake. Not as a relic, but as a quiet offering for someone else who might need to remember, you are not too much. You are simply more than they knew how to hold. Some mornings don't begin with clocks or alarms. They begin with something quieter. The shift of light on the windowsill, the way a cat stretches in perfect silence, or how the air feels heavier before it rains. That Thursday, Claire woke before the kettle clicked, before the sea made itself known through her bedroom window. She sat up, not from rest, but from something she couldn't quite name, a tension not in the body but in the spirit. The walk to the shop was misty. Maple leaves had begun their slow golden decay, and the narrow streets wore the hush of late autumn. She unlocked the bookstore, let Leonard in ahead of her, and did all the ordinary things. Turned on the lights, flipped the sign to open, chose a Nina Simone record for the morning. But her hands felt slower, like they were waiting for something before the day could begin. At 9:52, the bell over the door chimed. Claire looked up. It was still early for customers, but the woman who entered moved like someone who'd walked, far enough not to care about timing anymore. She was maybe 24, 25. Shoulders hunched beneath a thrifted trench coat, mascara smudged at the corner of one eye. Her presence carried that quiet urgency of someone searching not for an object, but for relief. Claire didn't speak at first. The woman wandered between shelves, touching spines with the hesitant reverence of someone used to being told they read the wrong things. Eventually, she approached the counter with a book in her hand, something forgettable and mass market. But the way she clutched it suggested it was a life raft. "Sorry," the girl said. "I don't know exactly what I'm looking for." Claire offered the kind of smile that doesn't require the face to move much. "That's usually when we find the best things." The girl nodded, then paused. "Do you have anything for people who feel too much?" Claire froze, not visibly, not obviously, but internally, like a wave pausing before it crashes. "What do you mean by too much?" she asked softly. The girl's voice thinned. "People say I overthink. I cry over things that happened days ago. I talk too much about feelings. I ruin good days by worrying they'll end. I love too quickly and mourn too long." There was no irony in her voice, only exhaustion. Claire inhaled, slowly, deeply. Without another word, she walked to the far poetry shelf, her fingertips gliding across old friends, Rilke, Plath, Rich. Then she stopped at Carson, Plain Water, a copy she herself had once written in before replacing it with a newer edition. She handed it over. "This book won't tell you how to change. It won't tell you to shrink. It'll just sit with you in the dark." The girl took it in both hands, reverently. She looked up. "Does it help?" Claire thought about that. "Not right away," she said, "but it helps you stop apologizing. And sometimes that's the beginning." The girl smiled, and it was crooked and uncertain, but it stayed. "I think I've been waiting to hear someone say that for a long time." Claire nodded. "So had I." When the girl left, Claire didn't go back to shelving. She sat on the old stool behind the counter and looked out the window for a long time, watching the way the light shifted on the sidewalk like breath. She was remembering something she didn't want to remember, but couldn't stop. It was a memory from her early 30s during a fight with Evan that hadn't started as a fight. They were in the kitchen. She'd asked him if he still felt close to her. He had sighed, not in frustration, but in disinterest. "You're always chasing closeness," he'd said. "Can't you just let things be?" She remembered the way her chest had folded inward, the way she had said nothing for fear of sounding needy. That night, she went to sleep with her back turned, but her heart reaching. Now, years later, watching a girl half her age walk away with a book she once needed, Claire wondered how many women had carried the same invisible wound. 1,000 different variations of the same ache. I wanted too much, so I asked for less, and no one noticed I was starving. That night, Claire pulled out an old notebook from beneath her bed, the one she'd stopped writing in after Evan left. It smelled like lavender and dust. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. "A girl came into the shop today. She reminded me of someone I lost, someone I'm trying to find again. Me." The invitation had been sitting on the edge of her desk for nearly 2 weeks, collecting dust and indecision. After the encounter with the girl at the bookstore, Claire found herself glancing at it more often, like a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open, but couldn't bring herself to close. She didn't need to go. There was nothing left unsaid between her and Evan, or so she had convinced herself. But some truths aren't about words. They're about what you finally stop carrying. 3 days before the reunion, Claire stood in front of her wardrobe longer than she intended. She wasn't choosing a dress, she was choosing a version of herself. The green one, soft at the waist, held memories of afternoons alone, of teacups and silence. The navy one had been her mother's. But there was another, a quiet, rust-colored dress she hadn't worn since a fall evening many years ago, back when she still thought being careful would protect her from pain. She chose that one. The drive to the university was long enough to let the past bubble up gently. She passed streets they used to walk down hand in hand, cafes where she used to pretend the silence between them was companionable, not hollow. With each mile, Claire didn't feel dread. She felt readiness, like something long buried had shifted and was finally rising to the surface, not to haunt her, but to be seen. The hall was brighter than she remembered, its walls repainted, its lighting warmer. People mingled around high tables, balancing glasses of wine and half-hearted laughter. She recognized a few faces. Some smiled, some double-took with the delighted shock of those who never imagined she'd return. And then she saw him. Evan stood near the far wall, speaking to a man Claire vaguely recalled from their philosophy class. He looked older. Of course he did. But there was something else. A tension at the edges. As if life had finally demanded things of him that she once offered freely, and he had refused to hold. He turned. Their eyes met. And something inside her went still, not frozen, not afraid, just still. He walked toward her slowly, and Claire felt time folding in on itself, not cruelly, but as if to say, "See? You survived." "Claire," he said, his voice low, familiar. She nodded. "Hello, Evan." They stood in the soft din of chatter, two people orbiting something unspoken. "You look well," he said. She smiled, but only with her mouth. "I am." "Bookstore, right? I saw something online once. Someone posted a photo. You looked happy." "I am," she repeated, and meant it more this time. There was a pause. He looked down, then up. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," she admitted. He took a sip of his drink, then spoke more quietly. "I read something a while ago, about how people don't stop loving deeply. They just stop being punished for it. Made me think of you." Claire blinked, but didn't flinch. "That's ironic." He nodded. "I deserved that." A silence stretched between them, not tense, but weighty. "I didn't come here to reopen anything," she said. "I know. I came to see if I still disappeared when you looked at me." He looked up at her, startled. "You never disappeared." "You just never saw," she replied. "There's a difference." His face softened. "I didn't know how." "I know," she said. And it wasn't an accusation. It was an obituary. They didn't hug. There was no dramatic walk-away. Just a quiet nod and a parting of eyes that had once stared too long and understood too little. Claire stepped outside minutes later, the evening air crisp, the sky bruised with the last light of day. She didn't feel lighter. She felt more real. When she returned to the bookstore the next morning, she placed something new on the poetry table, a handwritten card beside the Carson book. For the women who've been told they're too much, or asked to become less. May you never again shrink to fit a love that won't stretch. It started with a drawer, one that hadn't been opened in over 7 years. It was the kind of drawer people stop noticing over time, not because it's hidden, but because what it holds becomes too familiar in absence. And yet, on a soft gray afternoon when the sea fog hung low and the bookstore was empty of voices but full of breath, Claire found herself standing in front of it again. She didn't plan to. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some sudden compulsion. It was just that she was dusting the lower shelves, and her fingers brushed against the little brass knob and lingered. And when they lingered, something inside her said, "It's time." She pulled the drawer open with both hands. It gave easily, without resistance. And there it was. The small, smooth wooden box with a hairline crack at the corner and a piece of blue ribbon tied clumsily around its middle. Evan had once used it for cufflinks. She had kept it after he left, not because it mattered, but because it didn't. It was one of the few things that felt neutral enough to carry forward, until she realized what she'd hidden inside. Sitting alone behind the counter, the box in her lap, the shop silent except for the low hiss of the heater and the occasional creak of the old floorboards, Claire untied the ribbon. Inside, time had folded itself into small things. A subway ticket from a weekend they had planned in Chicago, but never taken. A scrap of a torn photo, his sleeve, her laughter, someone's hand almost touching. A Polaroid from their first Christmas, faded and slightly bent, with "Don't forget this" scribbled on the back in his handwriting. And at the very bottom, an envelope, addressed in her own hand, never sealed, never mailed. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. She knew what it was, knew even before the edges of her name flickered in memory. It was the letter she'd written on the night she realized she was leaving him. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, spiritually, at the level no apology could ever reach. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from reverence, like touching the version of herself who had finally, just once, told the truth without softening it. She unfolded the letter slowly. No sound but paper. No voice but memory. I don't know how to love you without disappearing. The first line was enough to draw blood if she let it. She didn't. I thought if I loved you quietly enough, you'd stop being afraid of my noise. But all that ever did was make me afraid of my own voice. Claire paused. The words had weight. Even now. Even when she was no longer living inside the apology. You say I overwhelm you. That I talk about feelings too much. That I make everything bigger than it needs to be. And maybe I do. Maybe that's who I am. But shrinking hasn't made me easier to love. It's just made me lonelier next to you. The paper curled at the edges from years of silence. She pressed it flat. If I leave, and I think I will, it won't be because I stopped loving you. It will be because I finally remembered how to love myself louder than your discomfort. The final line was underlined, twice. The ink had smudged a little. She didn't know if from tears or haste. Claire closed her eyes. This wasn't rage. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even grief. It was recognition. She refolded the letter, carefully, the way you fold something you're finally ready to keep. Not bury. She didn't put it back in the box. Instead, she walked slowly to the poetry section, her sanctuary, her church, the part of the shop that smelled like old paper and answered prayers. She reached behind the second shelf and pulled out a copy of The Dream of a Common Language by Adrienne Rich, her own copy, dog-eared and quiet. She opened it to page 37, her favorite page, and slid the letter inside. She didn't do it to forget. She did it to honor. Returning to the counter, Claire sat and opened her journal. The page was blank. She wrote, "Today, I met the woman I used to be. The one who begged in silence and broke in lowercase. I think she waited for me all these years. Not to rescue her, but to hear her. And tonight, I did." She closed the journal. Closed the drawer. Let the box sit open on the desk. There were no tears, only breath, and the space it had finally found to move through. It was 2 days after she found the letter that the package arrived. There was no return address, no sender name. Just a small padded envelope with the bookstore's name handwritten on the front. The kind of envelope people send when they don't want to be traced, but don't want to be ignored either. Claire turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a small, square journal, leather-bound, frayed at the edges, the kind sold at university gift shops a lifetime ago. She opened, It wasn't a journal exactly. Not in the way she used them. It was more like a collection. Notes, fragments, beginnings of letters never finished. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. Evans. Claire felt her heart do something strange. Tighten, then loosen. She hadn't seen his handwriting since the last Christmas card. Hastily written, forgotten in a shoebox. She sat down. The first page was blank, except for one line, centered. There are things I should have said when you were still looking at me like I mattered. Claire didn't breathe for a moment. She turned the page. His voice poured through the ink, more hesitant than she remembered, but real, tangled, human. She read in silence. You were never difficult. You were just awake in a world that rewarded sleep. I mistook your depth for weight, your emotion for mess, your questions for threats. But really, you were just trying to make us real. I only knew how to stay surface. Page after page. Sometimes, only a sentence, sometimes an unfinished thought. A line that stopped her. You once cried because I didn't ask how your day was. I laughed. You stopped crying. I thought that was a win. It wasn't. Claire closed the journal and held it to her chest. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. It wasn't forgiveness. And it wasn't regret. It was something far more complicated. Recognition. There had been two sides to that silence after all. Not all of it was his fault. But not all of it had to be hers to carry. She thought of the letters she had written him. The one now pressed between Adrienne Rich's verses. They were twin confessions, born too far apart to save anything, but close enough to finally meet. Claire didn't call him. She didn't write back. Instead, that evening, she returned to her favorite table in the back corner of the bookstore and wrote herself a new letter. One without shame. Dear Claire, you stayed. Too long. Because you thought endurance was a virtue. It wasn't. You left, quietly, because you thought loud exits were selfish. They weren't. You loved, fiercely, because that's who you are. Don't ever soften the edges that hold you together. She folded it once. No envelope. No ribbon. Just a letter to herself. Finally received. And when she placed it beside the journal Evan had sent, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel longing. She felt closure. But not the kind that slams doors. The kind that lets them stay open, gently, so nothing gets trapped behind them anymore. Later that night, she turned the store's sign to closed, even though it was only 5:30. The wind had picked up, and the street outside shimmered in dusky gold. As she stepped out to lock the door, she paused. Someone had taped a single daffodil to the glass. No note. Just the flower, still fresh, still open. Claire smiled. Not for him, not for what could have been, but for everything she finally chose to feel and keep. The bookstore had always been her sanctuary, walls lined with other people's truths, their regrets and redemptions spelled out in clean, printed fonts that didn't shout but whispered. On that Thursday afternoon, the world outside was quiet, the kind of overcast gray that held no urgency. The town moved slowly, as if in sync with the rhythm Claire had come to prefer. Quiet mornings, measured conversations, no expectations. She didn't know what stirred the feeling. Maybe it was the way the wind tapped gently against the window panes like it had something to say. Maybe it was the way the tea turned cold before she realized she hadn't touched it. Or maybe it was the simple act of shelving books. How her hand paused over a familiar title. How her breath caught not from the story, but from who she had been when she first read it. She set the book down, spine first, and stared at the space it left behind. It was a small gap, no larger than a postcard, but it threw the symmetry off, disrupted the illusion of order she had so carefully built. She tried shifting the books around, pressing them tighter together, but the space remained, stubborn and slightly too wide to ignore. And something in her cracked. Not like a shattering, not even a breaking, just a quiet giving way, like the slow bend of a branch under too many winters. She sat down behind the counter, not because she was tired, but because suddenly she couldn't find the strength to keep pretending that the life she'd built, calm, deliberate, solitary, wasn't, also stitched together from absence. It wasn't Evan she missed. Not really. It was the self she had let disappear in the years she spent trying not to be difficult. She missed being the kind of woman who spoke before thinking how it would sound, who laughed with her whole body, even when the room fell quiet, who cried at songs in the car and didn't wipe her tears away quickly in case someone noticed, who told the truth, not just to others, but to herself. And slowly, as she sat there with the air thick around her and Leonard asleep near her feet, she realized that she had spent the better part of a decade apologizing for being the very thing that made her worth loving. She had learned to dilute her joy, filter her sadness, temper her opinions. She had become smaller, quieter, easier, not because anyone asked her to, but because no one had stayed when she was whole. That was the real grief, not the end of a relationship, not even the words unsaid, or the love unreturned. It was the realization that somewhere along the way she had believed them, all of them. Every man, every friend, every voice that had labeled her too much, too sensitive, too serious, and she had listened. Not all at once, but little by little, like stones dropped in a river until the current changed direction entirely. There was no dramatic memory, no singular betrayal that marked her undoing. Just the soft erosion of herself over time, moment by moment, until she woke one day and didn't recognize the woman who held herself together by keeping quiet. Claire looked around the shop. Every object had its place. The shelves were dusted. The window display changed with the seasons. Customers smiled and complimented the atmosphere, the music, the tea. But none of them knew that the woman behind the counter had once loved so fully, so openly, that it frightened people away. None of them saw the version of her who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen, recite poetry out loud, believe that being known was a kind of homecoming. And now, that version was gone. Not dead, not destroyed, just missing. Like a name you forget to say for so long, it starts to dissolve at the edges, and in that moment, Claire didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't write. She simply let the ache settle. Let the silence name what had been lost, and she knew some parts of you never return, not because they were broken, but because you waited too long to call them back. That evening, Claire closed the bookstore earlier than usual, though there was no real reason to. The town was still, the sky heavy with mist, and not a single customer had walked in after 4. But it wasn't about the quiet. It was about something else. Something she couldn't quite name but had begun to recognize each time she caught her reflection moving slower than she remembered. She didn't bother with music. The silence felt earned. She let the kettle boil and left the cup untouched, the way she had done too often lately, preparing comfort without ever taking it in. The candle on the table flickered faintly. She didn't light it to soften the room, but to make the shadows more visible. That was the thing about candlelight. Its beauty didn't come from its glow, but from the contrast it cast, from how it let darkness live alongside warmth. She sat on the old armchair by the window, one hand resting on the curve of the cup, the other tracing the hem of the cardigan she wore. Soft wool, threadbare in places, sleeves slightly stretched. Evan used to call it her sad sweater. She used to laugh and say it wasn't sad, just honest. But now, sitting there, she wasn't so sure. The house around her didn't feel lonely. It felt emptied, of noise, of chaos, of love, but mostly of permission. The permission to feel, to want, to need loudly. She had let go of so many things over the years to keep the peace, and now peace was all she had. and it was hollow. She stood up without thinking and walked barefoot through the hallway, her steps soft against the creaking wood. The walls were lined with framed prints, muted landscapes, and dried flower arrangements that had outlived their colors. Each item was placed with intention, and yet none of it felt inhabited. When she reached the mirror near the front door, the long, narrow one she passed every morning but never really looked into, she paused. What she saw wasn't shocking. It was familiar. Too familiar. The woman in the reflection had gentle eyes, tired at the corners, lips that curved more easily in quiet agreement than in fierce defense. Her hair was tied back as always, practical. Her posture, slightly closed in, like she had learned over time how to take up just enough space to be appreciated, but not enough to be noticed. Claire looked at that version of herself and whispered the truth. You were the one who left. Not Evan, not the past, not life. It was her. She had walked out on herself, not on a single day, but over years, one compromise at a time, one silence at a time, one smile that said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. She had wanted love so badly, she gave away the parts of her that love was supposed to protect, and by the time she realized it, those parts were gone, not destroyed, not stolen, just left behind, like old clothes in someone else's closet, like books never returned, like letters never sent. Claire sat down on the floor beneath the mirror, legs folded, hands in her lap. She didn't cry. There was no sound in the room, not even the tick of the wall clock. What she felt wasn't grief. It was accountability, the soft, crushing weight of realizing that no one had asked her to disappear. She had chosen it, again and again, hoping that if she made herself small enough, someone would call her big enough to stay. But love doesn't work like that, and she knew, without bitterness, that some versions of her might never come back. Not because she couldn't find them, but because she'd taught them over time not to trust her anymore. It arrived the way most things that matter do, quietly, without warning, on a morning that didn't seem to need anything from the world, except a hot cup of tea and a reason to stretch. Claire had just unlocked the door to the shop and set her bag on the counter when she noticed it. A cream-colored envelope slipped halfway under the door. No stamp, no return address. Just her name, written in ink so faint she had to hold it toward the light to read it. Her first instinct was that it was from a customer, someone dropping off a note, a lost bookmark, perhaps a forgotten payment. But something about the paper stopped her. It was thick, textured, a kind of intentional that normal errands didn't require. She held it for a moment, then placed it beside the register and walked away. She made her tea. Fed Leonard. Rearranged the front table of autumn-themed novels for the third time that week. And still, the envelope waited. When she finally opened it, alone behind the counter, with the morning light streaming in like a whisper, it was not what she expected. It was a letter, handwritten, careful cursive, slightly slanted, unmistakable. She knew the hand. Even before she reached the second line, she knew. I've started this letter a dozen times. I've thrown out every version but this one. It's the only one that doesn't try to explain or fix or ask for anything. It just speaks. Claire's breath slowed. There were things I never said, things I thought didn't matter or would just make things worse. But silence didn't make anything better. It just made you lonelier. And me, emptier. Her eyes moved slowly down the page. You once told me it felt like you were speaking into a canyon, that you'd send out words and they'd echo back unanswered, until eventually you stopped speaking at all. I told you were being dramatic, but you weren't. You were right. The room around her seemed to go quiet in a different way. Now, not just hushed but suspended. You weren't too much. You were just clear, honest, present, and I was never brave enough to meet you there. There was more, a page and a half. No dates, no signature. But it didn't matter. She knew. Not. From the handwriting, though that was unmistakable. She knew because of the pauses, the self-consciousness between sentences, the way he admitted only what he could stand to admit, and let the rest breathe between the lines. It was Evan. It had to be. And what struck her wasn't the content. It wasn't even that he remembered. It was that somewhere, at some point, he had begun to understand. Even if it had come too late to matter, he had arrived at the truth of things. Not the details, not the who did what when, but the truth beneath it. The one she had stopped waiting. For she placed the letter down beside her tea, untouched. Her eyes welled, not with tears but with something gentler. The kind of ache that doesn't ask to be fixed, only witnessed. She thought of the letter she had written years ago, the one she never sent. Still pressed between pages 37 and 38 of Adrian Rich's The Dream of a Common Language. How she'd poured everything into it not for him, but for herself. A letter to make her visible again. A letter to survive herself. Now, this. This was not a plea. Not a door opening. It was a moment meeting a moment, across time, across change, across silence. She stood slowly, carrying the letter with both hands, and walked to the poetry shelf. There, in the quiet corner of the store where she had once placed her pain, she opened the book. Her letter was still there, creased, soft-edged from years of being hidden and never forgotten. She unfolded both pages and laid them side by side on the counter. Two voices, neither loud, neither accusing, just facing each other, as they never had in real life. She sat. The store remained still, and she began to write, not a reply, but a reflection. A note folded inside her journal, labeled simply, "For the woman I once asked to become smaller. I'm sorry I wasn't big enough to meet her." She didn't know if she'd keep it, or burn it, or file it between the pages. But as she placed it alongside the others, she felt something shift, not closure. That word was too final, too sharp, but clarity, and it was enough. That night, Claire didn't read the letter again. She didn't need to. It wasn't the kind of letter that asked to be studied. It was the kind you carry in your palm, warm and fragile, and choose to hold. Not because it changes anything, but because it tells you that once, you mattered enough for someone to find the words they couldn't say when it counted. She left it on the counter. No envelope, no drawer, no desire to hide it. The candle by the window burned lower than usual. The shadows it cast stretched longer across the floor, softening the edges of everything. In that light, even the bookshelves seemed less rigid, like they too had exhaled. Claire made herself a cup of tea, not out of habit, but because her hands wanted something to do. She sat by the window and listened, not for sounds but for herself, the version of her that had once been drowned out by the noise of trying too hard. And in that silence, she let the memory come. A late autumn evening, years ago. A dinner they never quite finished. Evan had made pasta, overcooked, a little too salty. She'd been quiet, distracted by a rejection email from a journal she had sent a poem to. He had asked if something was wrong, and she'd said, "No, I'm just tired." He'd nodded, not pushed. She had wanted him to ask again, to say, "I know you. You're not tired. You're disappointed. Tell me where it hurts." He never did, and she never asked him to. It wasn't the moment that had broken them. It was that too many moments like it had passed. Tiny, almost invisible ones. The kind that build a home or slowly empty one. But tonight, with the letter still, sitting in the open, something changed in how she remembered it. He hadn't known how to ask, and she had been too tired to teach him. She smiled then. Not bitterly, not sadly, just enough to let the moment rest. Because healing doesn't always come with explanations. Sometimes it arrives like this: a sentence on a page that opens a window in a room you forgot was closed. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. There was a softness to the light, a silver calm that made everything feel newly washed. She put on the kettle, let Leonard brush against her ankles, and reached for her notebook. Not the journal. The notebook, the one she used only when she was beginning something. She wrote slowly, not trying to be profound, just honest. I don't want to rewrite the past. I just want to reread it with kinder eyes. Maybe that's the closest we ever get to redemption, not being forgiven by others, but forgiving ourselves for believing we were never enough. She paused, then drew a small line beneath the words and closed the notebook. It was still early when she opened the bookstore. The bell over the door jingled with its usual tune, but today it sounded different, like an old song that still meant something, even if you didn't know all the words anymore. Just before noon, a woman walked in, middle-aged, hair tucked into a wool beret, face unfamiliar. She wandered for a while, trailing her fingers across the shelves with a kind of tenderness Claire always noticed. The woman picked up a copy of The Dream of a Common Language, read a page or two, then looked up and asked, "Do you believe poetry ever forgives us?" Claire tilted her head, then smiled. "I think poetry is what's left when nothing else does." The woman bought the book and left without another word, but something lingered. After she'd gone, Claire walked back to the poetry shelf. The book the woman had held was not the copy with the letters inside. It was a newer edition, stiff-spined and untouched. But still, the timing felt precise, almost like a whisper. Claire reached for her own copy. She pulled out the two letters, read neither, but ran her fingers along the fold of the pages. Then she folded them back, pressed them into the spine, and returned the book to its place. It no longer felt like a hiding spot. It felt like a resting place. That evening, as she stood at the front door of the shop, ready to turn the sign from open to closed, she looked out at the street. The last light of day stretched long across the pavement, catching in the corners of buildings and windows. For a brief moment, everything shimmered, not with magic, but with clarity. With the soft understanding that sometimes what we needed most wasn't to be answered, but to be heard. And maybe, after all these years, she had been. Claire didn't notice the exact day the ache inside her began to fade, not because it stopped hurting all at once, but because it had begun to hurt differently. Less like a wound, more like a scar that only stings when pressed. She didn't mark it on a calendar. She didn't take a picture or write a poem. She simply stopped reaching for something that no longer lived in the space between then and now. She still ran the bookstore, still watered the tiny plant in the front window even though it never seemed to grow, still made tea at the same hour, every afternoon. But lately, she had begun doing small things she used to love, without explaining them to anyone. She played old records while cleaning. Let herself finish entire pages in her journal without editing a single sentence. She stopped, muting the music when a sad song came on. One morning, she rearranged the poetry shelf again. It was early, the kind of early that still tasted like night. She held her copy of The Dream of a Common Language in both hands, knowing the weight of it by heart. Inside were the two letters, hers and his, still folded, still pressed between the same two pages. She hadn't reread them, not since placing them there together. But she liked knowing they were there, like two truths, resting quietly beside each other, no longer asking to be solved. She closed the book and slid it back onto the shelf. Later, that week, a stranger came into the shop, a man in his 50s, quiet, polite, with the kind of eyes that have seen something end and still know how to look forward. He wandered the shelves for a while, then brought up a collection of short stories. When Claire rang it up, he said, without prompting, "I read somewhere that we carry our regrets like stones, but I think maybe they're more like rivers. They reshape us slowly, without asking." Claire didn't say much, just nodded. After he left, she wrote that down in her notebook. Not to remember him, but to remember how it felt when someone said something and didn't need her to respond. That evening, she took a longer walk home, past the bakery that had stopped selling her favorite bread, past the old church with chipped paint and warm light. She took the path by the sea, not for nostalgia, but because the salt air had started to feel like her own breath again. She reached the overlook, the bench that faced the cliffs, the one people rarely sat on because the wind made conversation difficult. She sat anyway. The sun was beginning to sink, not in gold or flame, but in soft pewter tones. The ocean didn't shimmer, it breathed. Claire looked out at it all, let her coat stay unbuttoned, let the cold nip her cheeks, and in that moment, she didn't think of Evan. Not in longing, not in sadness, not even in clarity. She thought of herself, sitting in the same spot years ago, asking questions into the wind, waiting for someone else to answer them. And she realized she had finally answered them herself. It hadn't come from closure, or an apology, or a perfect sentence, tucked inside a letter. It had come from staying. From continuing to wake up and do the small things. From not rushing. From not needing to prove anything to anyone. She smiled, barely. But it was the kind of smile that stays even when no one is watching. When she returned home that night, the house smelled faintly of rosemary and old books. She poured herself a glass of water, lit the candle by the window, not for memory, but for presence. Sat in the quiet, folded her knees beneath her, and opened her notebook again. She wrote, "There is no dramatic ending here. Only a woman who stayed, who waited for herself to come home, and this time knew how to open the door." She underlined the final line, not twice, just once, enough. The next day, she changed the window display, removed the quote that had sat there for almost a year, yellowed at the edges. In its place, she wrote something small, handwritten on plain paper. "You are not hard to love. You were just louder than their silence could hold." She didn't post it on social media, didn't mention it to friends. She simply taped it to the inside of the glass and left it there. A few people paused to read it. One woman smiled. A man touched the edge of the window gently, as though the words had reached somewhere he hadn't touched in a while. Claire didn't watch them long. She was behind the counter, organizing bookmarks, humming softly to herself. No one else needed to know that those words had once been hers, that she had once believed them for the first time, and now, again, for the last. And maybe, just maybe, they belong to someone else now too. Have you ever stayed silent when your heart wanted to speak? Or written something just to feel real? Again, if any part of this story reminded you of a version of yourself, you're not alone. Feel free to share a memory, a sentence, or just a word below. Sometimes that's all it takes for someone else to say, "Me too."